Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 8, Reconciled, Part 2. A very young Thomas sat at a desk as he waited. He was in a very nice office that had several pictures of former department heads that had recently occupied the chair which sat vacant across from him. He looked around at the filing cabinets and bulletin boards, noting the familiar assignments spread around the room. Suddenly, the door behind him opened and a man walked through. It was a slender white male, appearing to be in his early 40s. Thomas, not knowing why he had been sequestered, sat nervously waiting to be addressed. The gentleman, who wore a suit and tie and a decorative pin of the American flag on his coat lapel, quickly rifled through files in a cabinet, soon crossing one of interest as he pulled it out. The man paid little attention to Thomas as he came around the desk and placed the file in front of him. The sign on his desk read, Senior Deputy Director Stephen Ryans. As Mr. Ryans took a seat, he opened the file and began poring over its contents. Impressive. You graduated high school when you were only 17 and then pursued a career with the Department of Justice, becoming an agent with the FBI at 23. And now you're hitting home runs while you're still practically walking through the door. Within your first year, you took down several cartel generals, reducing their output to a fraction of its potential, managing to rewrite the FBI playbook on organized crime. Mr. Ryans closed Thomas's file and folded his arms while looking across the table. I have an assignment for you. A man by the name of Kostyalenkov will be in touch with you sometime this evening. You are to meet him for dinner. He has a hard drive that we want. In exchange, I'm sending you with his payment. You will then need to get a team together and begin to profile this man. We need you to profile this empire he oversees in Russia. Profile his highest and most loyal associates. We need to make sure we're not being double-crossed. This is an extremely important assignment, as that hard drive contains the code the Russians used recently to break into one of our technology firms, a company called Dark Scope. As I'm sure you've heard of this outfit and its importance to our national security, I feel confident that you will give this assignment the sense of urgency it requires. Bring me the hard drive agent shields. Thomas looked at the man and grew slightly frustrated by being Mr. Ryan's errand boy. However, he maintained his temper out of respect for the high-ranking official. With all due respect, Mr. Ryans, I'm right in the middle of a case dealing with the origins of a virus we found cropping out of South America 8 years ago. Somehow, it wasn't fully contained back then, and now it's posing a massive threat, he said, as he noticed Ryan simply looked down at his phone as if he weren't even listening. Nevertheless, the young agent finished his argument. There is something more to this virus, though. It's as if someone has been preventing the science community from connecting the dots. I think it might have to do with the origins of the health pandemic we are seeing start to unfold, which has already given our country a tremendous burden. If we let this become more out of hand than it already is, our sources believe we could see a heavy revolt from the American population. It's beginning to look like a cover-up. It's gonna look like we let the virus mutate. My team is close to cracking this thing wide open, and we've just picked up some key leads. I really think my abilities are more useful if I remain on my current assignment. Mr. Ryans didn't look at Thomas, as he had already stood up and was gathering his things while quickly heading for his office door. I couldn't agree with you more, Agent Shields. However, this is more important as it poses a much more serious threat. Besides, one of the higher-ups at Darkscope agreed to put his men on this. They are very interested in this virus, and seeing that they have priority, the case is being referred to their lab unit. The decision is already made. I'm sure Darkscope will be grateful with the progress you made, and I'm certain they'll put it to use. Now you are needed on this task. You will need to meet this oligarch. Thomas turned in his chair and looked at Mr. Ryans with a confused expression as he watched him quickly leave the room. Why can't you get Agent Keller on this? He's more familiar with Russian affairs. Ryans then responded as he made his way out the door. My hands are tied, Thomas. The Russian contact requested you. He won't hand over the hard drive unless he speaks with you personally tonight. Take care of it, Agent Shields. That evening, Thomas found himself looking at a small, fine dining establishment directly across the street from where he was parked. As he sat in his car in a dark parking lot, he watched a limousine pull up to the front doors. He watched as a heavier Russian gentleman, appearing to be in his late 30s, stepped away from the vehicle and walked inside. After a few moments, Thomas also stepped out of his car in a long black trench coat and crossed the street while paying close attention to his surroundings. Light jazz filled the air, the dimly lit restaurant boasting of exquisite wine and mahogany furniture. Kostya Lenkov sat by himself at a large booth near the back. The booth had tall, dark wooden walls around it, securing an optimal amount of privacy for the patrons of the well-to-do establishment. Lenkov drew his attention to Thomas, as he now stood quietly at the edge of the oligarch's table. Catching the Russian slightly off guard, it was as though Thomas had simply materialized there. Lenkov, used to dealing with agents at the top of their game, wasn't fazed by Thomas's stealth-like entry as he beckoned the FBI agent to sit down. Come, sit. Thomas sat down as Lenkov poured over the wine menu. After sitting for a moment in silence, a server approached the table. It was a younger black female who began to service their booth by bringing the 2 men glasses of ice water topped with wedges of lemon. Lenkov suddenly handed the menu to the waitress. We will be sharing a bottle of your Chateau Lafite. The server smiled as she took the menu and walked away. Lenkov then reached under the table and pulled out a briefcase. He placed it on the table and slid it to Mr. Shields. Thomas pulled the briefcase closer. He pulled the phone out and placed it on the case. Lenkov stared at Mr. Shields as they sat for a moment in silence, a slight sense of anxiety seeming to fill the air between them. Thomas held his gaze at the Russian and watched him closely for any sudden movement. Just then, Seeming to put the two back at ease, the phone lit up and the briefcase unlocked. Mr. Lenkov smiled at the nervous agent. He could tell Thomas wasn't comfortable negotiating with this Kremlin ally. Thomas, however, shook his unease and opened the briefcase. There, inside of it, was a hard drive. Thomas then immediately closed the case and placed it on the floor at his side. Just then, the server returned and brandished the very pricey bottle of wine before the two gentlemen. They each studied each other carefully as they sat in silence, waiting for the server to leave, seeking their recently lost privacy. After the wine had been uncorked, the server poured a small portion into Lenkov's wine glass. She then stood there silently as she awaited the Russian man's approval, which would cue her to finish pouring the two glasses for the gentleman. But Lenkov wasn't interested in sampling the expensive beverage as he placed a finger on the bottom of the glass and slid it to Thomas, cueing the FBI agent to sample it instead. Familiar with the ways of his communist counterpart, Thomas did not care for the idea of placing a glass to his lips that had recently been in the hands of a dangerous adversary. They both stared at each other for a moment, as Thomas noticed the server patiently waiting. He looked up at her and took the glass in his hands. He looked at Lenkov once more, placed the glass to his lips, and took his first sip. As he rolled it over his tongue, he gently swallowed and looked up at the server and raised his wine glass as he gave a nod, cueing her to finish pouring. Once she topped his glass off, originally belonging to the Russian, she poured the second portion in Thomas's original wine glass that sat right next to the other, leaving him with 2 full wine glasses. The server walked away as Thomas now took his turn and placed his finger on the unused wine glass as he slid it over to Lenkov. Lenkov bowed his head graciously and lifted his glass, suggesting a muted toast. As he put the glass to his lips, he slowly emptied the entire contents of his cup. He then placed his glass on the table as Thomas looked around before quietly speaking. "I was told you requested me specifically. Was there anything in particular I could help you with?" he said, intentionally conveying a lack of sincerity in his question. Lenkov ignored the undertone that came with the agent's question as he replied in broken English with a thick Russian accent. "Da, I have job for you." Thomas rolled his eyes, stood up and placed an envelope on the table, the payment for the hard drive. "I already have a job, Mr. Lenkov." Then, startling Thomas and momentarily gaining the attention of tables nearby, the Russian yelled, "Sit down." Mr. Shields froze and looked at Lenkov, having noticed the attention he was gathering. Against his better judgment, but also to take the attention off their booth, Thomas sat down once more. He impatiently watched as Lenkov slid an envelope over to him. Without even peering down at it, growing tired of the Russian's attempts to familiarize himself with the American, Thomas maintained his stare at Lenkov. The Russian, once more, began to speak. "On the 1st of next month, I am expecting shipment off shores of Ecuador. The cartel has been hired to execute these deliveries. Do not worry though, Mr. Shields. I assure you everything is legal. We are simply setting up channels in that area as we soon expect to have new client that will require anonymity that the Ecuadorian jungles provide. These shipments are to happen every month and require attention to detail that I don't trust many people with. Also, I need someone to keep an eye on a certain cartel leader north of this. I feel that this man might have too much of an appetite, and I want to ensure that he is not in any position to take over my operations. I will also need you to contain him, but you must contain him alive. He will be useful to our organization in the future." As he said this, he slid a photograph across the table, face down. Thomas then turned the picture over and laid his eyes on Lazar. He looked at it, recognizing the crime boss as he replied to the Russian. "You want me to secure a man the FBI has been chasing for years and contain him for you," Thomas said with annoyance in his breath as the Russian continued. "Da, it is a joint effort between our governments. He is, how you say, a potential asset. As you can understand, I have some difficulties keeping eyes on him from Moscow. So, you can see why I look to you." Thomas began to speak, wishing to put an abrupt end to this conversation. "Mr. Lenkov, I'm not sure what you have been told." Again, the Russian interrupted him. This time, though, he did so quietly so as not to garner any further unwanted attention. "Quiet, Mr. Shields. I am not done speaking." Thomas's face took on a look of frustration as he let the Russian continue. "You will be paid well for this job, Agent Shields. You will also be relocating to San Diego. I have already handled this matter with your agency." Thomas then became increasingly upset as he could not believe what he was hearing. Was this man insane? He thought to himself. But Lenkov continued just the same. "Dark Scope has already approved this request. They are very interested in the assistance we are offering and has allowed us to cooperate within your intelligence apparatus. So, this is where you come in. You must tell no one of my organization's relationship with Dark Scope." With that, the Russian, to Thomas's surprise, stood up as if to leave. He then placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, and his next words sent chills down Thomas's spine. "And in case you have the, how you Americans say, a cold foot, I've given you personalized incentive." With that, he patted Thomas's shoulder and left the table. Thomas, his heart now pounding, opened the envelope and pulled out a file. He opened the file as his heart sank. On each side of the file sat a picture. One of the pictures was that of a small boy in diapers sitting on Thomas's lap. It was a picture that had been taken at a park just days ago. Of course, this would not be enough to get the agent to become subservient to the oligarch, and Lenkov was clearly aware of that. He knew that Thomas was loyal to his country and must have just the right bait for the young American to comply. And this notion materialized into a bargaining chip within the other photograph, as it was a picture taken of Thomas inside his own car a few weeks back with a woman he recognized. It was his mistress, the woman he had been having an affair with for the last several months. Thomas closed the file and grew a concerned look as he shifted his gaze to the front doors, the Russian now gone from sight. Finally, Thomas snapped out of his daze before slipping the photograph away from the folder. He looked at the photograph, losing himself within his thoughts. He then took it and placed it in his coat pocket as he placed a pair of binoculars to his face and looked out over the dark jungles of Colombia at the town that lay before him. It was the town of Tunja. As he studied the town, he listened as Chavez made his first observation. "I don't see any evidence of them here, senor. Are you sure you have the right coordinates?" Thomas lowered his binoculars and looked at Chavez while rolling his eyes. "I'm sure. Let's go." Just then, they got back in their truck within the Sinaloa's convoy. As the large army slowly descended upon this community, nestled in the Colombian woodlands off in the distance, a small ray of light came over the horizon, ushering with it the early morning sun. As an attempt to fill in even more blanks within this story, one refocuses on a particular event 11 years later in the year 2052. It was evening, as the streets glowed within an amber light, complements of the many lampposts that lined the brick roads. As the moon overhead was full, being joined with the city lights below, this sprawling city laid in a muted spotlight as a 3-story government building sat by, towering over the city streets it sat upon. The old building boasted of granite stone decor, with a slight Gothic undertone, lights from its windows still lit from within. But at the top level of this building, one of these windows seemed out of place, as this one was darkened and completely wide open. Off in the distance, first responders could be heard approaching, while their sirens sounded off at a high and deafening pitch. Eventually, they came to a stop in front of this 3-level structure, while several officers swarmed the lower-level doors. And while this took place, officers conducted a thorough perimeter while the immediate surroundings were soon locked down. As several uniformed men and women peered up at the top window that was opened, while the lights inside remained off, several spotlights began to shine at the building, while the captain stepped forward with a loudspeaker, beginning to address a situation above. The building before them served as an apartment for Congress personnel, and his station had just received a disturbing phone call from one of its current occupants. "This is the Baltimore Police. This building is now surrounded," he said, while following it up by placing his hand over his receiver. He looked over to his sergeant, who was standing, awaiting orders as he spoke to her in a quieter tone. "How long for the snipers to be in position?" She turned and looked at her superior as she replied with her prepared answer while looking at her watch. 2, maybe 3 minutes. As she said this, he raised his speaker back to his mouth as he began to speak once more, directing his words to the top floor. "Let's work something out. It doesn't have to be this way. We just want to help." Suddenly, the captain could hear his officers gasp as a body was thrown from the above window as it smacked to the side of the building. And as it dangled there, it was clear to see that it had a noose around its neck. But with his experience, the captain immediately knew that this wasn't what had killed this man, now dangling above them, as there were no cries for help as he fell. As he looked up, he could see who it was, as the now hanging man near the top floor window wore a black 3-piece suit with an American pin on the lapel of his coat. And after identifying his crime scene's first victim, he grew slightly angry as he looked over to his sergeant. "Call it in." As she leaned toward her radio, she said a few words while pressing a button to the small receiver fixed to her right shoulder. "Hostage down." "Repeat, hostage down." But then she stopped as everyone looked up in shock. Immediately, and leaving no room for negotiations, 7 more men and women in similar attire all fell from adjacent windows as they joined the one below, each already deceased. The captain peered up as his sergeant looked over to him and made a statement that echoed in his mind, while he stared into the depths of his 7 failed objectives. "So much for negotiations," she said as he tossed her the loudspeaker and gave his entire force behind him an order. "2 teams up to the top. Bring them down alive. I don't want any more blood." And as he finished saying these words, nearly a dozen officers ran past him to the steps of the building as they began to systematically conduct security sweeps, making their way through the large wooden front doors. That was when the captain was redirected to the hanging deaths over his head, as one of his men made a curious observation. "Sir, there's 8 of them." And as the captain looked up to the bodies, he watched as they swayed, trying to figure out where their intel had gone wrong, as there were only 7 reported hostages. As that happened, he noticed one victim was not on his list, and as he studied the figure closer, he slowly walked toward the building, trying to identify the dead stranger. Once close enough to get a better view, his heart skipped several beats while he quickly pulled his radio to his mouth. "Pull back. Everyone out of the building, now." Soon the street came busier than before, as all his men loaded back into their vehicles. There was a good reason for the captain's change of plans, as he quickly ordered this abrupt evacuation. Because there, among the 7 bodies, hung an 8th. And on this 8th body, which was simply just a dummy, was a face covered by a mask. A mask of a smiling face. More troubling than this was a chain around its neck as the dummy face looked down at a small device in front of its own dummy chest. And then, from the large front doors, several officers returned from their attempted mission, now running for their lives. But suddenly, a loud explosion sounded off, as the building soon became engulfed in flames, sending several police officers through the air. Meanwhile, nearly 700 miles away, a precocious and familiar young girl sat in front of her television while coloring within her coloring book. Alexa, still smiling, listening to her music, looked up at the TV. While she listened to some of her favorite children's music, her smile vanished. A look of confusion and terror swept across her face. Her dad then stepped in front of the TV, turning it off as she looked up at him. "Come with me, Alexa. Everything is going to be okay. But we need to leave."